If the insurance pays out fast, we can list the house before Christmas, my daughter said. Her voice came from my living room, calm and businesslike, as if she were talking about a stranger. Mom's plane went down. We can't just leave everything sitting here forever. I was standing on my own front porch in my sensible shoes, my suitcase handle digging into my palm, listening through the same door I'd locked 3 weeks earlier. My name is Louise. I'm 72 years old, and contrary to what my daughter had clearly decided, I am not dead. I live alone in a little beige bungalow at the edge of a suburb outside Cleveland, Ohio, the kind where every mailbox leans a different way, and everyone knows who leaves their trash cans out too long. It was early November, the air damp and heavy, that kind of gray Ohio day when it feels like the sky is a low ceiling pressing down on you. I could smell wet leaves and somebody's chimney smoke, and under all that, the faint detergent smell that always clung to my own coat. My key, the brass one Harold installed when we bought this place 40 years ago, was cold in my hand. That key has hung on the same tiny hook by the door since before my daughter was born. The paint is worn there, a little half-moon of bare wood where hands have brushed it for decades. It has always meant the house was ours. It was the only thing solid in that moment when I heard my own child reshaping my life without me. Inside, I heard another voice. Lower, my son-in-law Dan. We should at least wait to see, a body or papers, he said, and his hesitation should have comforted me. It didn't. It only told me that the argument was not whether they should sell, but how quickly decency allowed them to do it. Dan, they said, no survivors on the news, Karen replied, her voice thinning just a little on the word survivors. I can't pay off our cards and keep the kids in their activities and keep worrying about her boiler and her roof. This could finally solve things. Finally solve things. Each word sat like a pebble in my shoe. I stepped back one pace from the door, my heart knocking so hard I could feel it in my throat. For a second I thought I might really drop right there on the porch, and then they would have their tragedy after all, neatly in the driveway. A car passed on the street behind me, tires hissing over the wet pavement. The world was still moving. People were still going to work and picking up kids and buying groceries. Somewhere in Cleveland, the hospital where I'd spent 2 nights after the crash, was probably changing sheets and emptying trash cans. Life was continuing, mine included. I turned the key in the lock, slowly. The sound of it was small but sharp, metal on metal, familiar as my own name. It felt obscene that I had to unlock my own house to walk into a conversation about selling it. The door opened with its usual stiff little sigh. Karen was standing by the mantel, one hand on the old round wall clock Harold had hung the day we moved in. That clock is our house heartbeat. Cream-colored face, black numbers, a fine crack across the glass from where my grandson's Nerf ball hit it 10 years ago. Harold adjusted it every daylight saving time with a tiny screwdriver, even the year before he died. After he passed, I started setting it myself, standing on the same dining chair he used, the wood creaking under my weight. Just now, Karen's hand rested on the frame as if she were about to take it down. For the first time in 40 years, the clock looked like it didn't belong to the wall. Dan sat on the couch, leaning forward, a manila folder on the coffee table, my coffee table next to my knitting basket. I saw a legal pad, a pen, the corner of an envelope with my own name printed on it in blue ink. I had seen enough hospital forms that week. I recognized that particular shade of official. "Well," I said, because I didn't know what else to say that wouldn't come out as a wail, "this is quite a meeting to be left off of." Karen spun around so fast her ponytail almost slapped the clock. The color drained from her face like someone had pulled a plug. "Mom," she choked, the word higher than it's been since she was a teenager, asking for the car keys. Dan stood up so quickly his knee hit the coffee table, making the pen roll. For a strange second, I watched the pen roll back and forth like a tiny metronome, measuring how long it took them to cross the room to me. "Of course it's me," I said, "unless you've already sold me too." It came out sharper than I'd rehearsed on the bus ride home, back when I'd imagined this moment instead of overhearing it. But there it was. I watched the words hit her. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked small and young and furious and guilty. All at once, the way she did when she broke that same front door window with a baseball in 7th grade. Except now she was 43, with 2 kids of her own and a worry line between her eyebrows that looked like mine. "You," she started, then stopped as if she had too many words in her throat at once. The news said, I thought you died," I finished for her, stepping fully inside and shutting the door behind me. The sound of the latch catching felt like a choice. Click. I looked up at the clock. It said 11:15. I had no idea if that was correct. In the hospital, I'd lost track of time. The days had been measured in beeps and blood pressure cuffs and the soft rubber of the nurse's shoes. Dan rubbed a hand over his face. "Louise," he said, "we thought your plane. They said there weren't survivors on your flight." "There weren't," I answered. "On my flight. Mine landed in a cornfield in Indiana instead of the runway. I was not technically on the one that made the headline crawl under Karen's morning show." I set my suitcase down by the hall table next to the little bowl where I keep spare change and paperclips. My wrist still ached from the bruise where the seatbelt had dug in, and there was a tenderness along my ribs that had nothing to do with bones. I spent 2 nights in a hospital with no power, no phones if you can believe it, and nurses who looked like children, then a bus, then a cab driver who talked enough for 3 people. So, no, I did not die. I apologize for any inconvenience to your schedule. Karen flinched. "That's not fair," she whispered, and there was a flash of heat in her eyes. "You don't know what it was like." I woke up to a text from Melissa that said, "Is that your mom's flight on the news?" And then I turned on the TV, and they were talking about a plane from Cleveland to Tampa and people crying at the airport. I couldn't reach you. I called your phone until it went straight to voicemail. I called the airline. I called every number they gave me. I believed her. I could see the truth of those calls in the way her shoulders had dropped, the faint shadows under her eyes that makeup hadn't covered. I believed she'd cried, that she'd paced that same living room, imagining awful things. I also believed she'd pivoted quickly from grief to numbers. Karen has always done math fast when she's scared. She calculates, organizes, strings order over panic like beads on a wire. The first time she heard Harold had cancer, she showed up with a spiral notebook and 3 different colored pens. I had loved her for that. I hadn't forgotten. "We were scared, Mom," Dan said. "Really scared. And the reporter said no survivors. And then they read names on the screen, and we saw your name." "Except it wasn't my flight," I said again softer. close enough to twist your stomach, but wrong enough that you're stuck in limbo. I heard one of the nurses say it's like an echo of someone else's disaster. I moved farther into the room, letting my fingertips brush the back of my favorite armchair, the one with the little floral print that everyone says is outdated. And those calls you made? They didn't reach me because my phone is currently somewhere in a field in Indiana under a pile of luggage and cheap airport souvenirs. It was easier to talk about the phone than about the moment when the plane dropped hard enough that the drinks flew, when a stranger's hand found mine and we prayed two different prayers at the same time. Easier than talking about the smell of burned plastic when we skidded, the way the oxygen masks swung like little dead birds. Easier than admitting I saw my own life shrink to a pinprick and then widen again, shocked and shaky. Silence settled on the room like dust. The clock on the wall ticked, loud and steady, as if it was the only one unbothered by the whole situation. Tick, tick, tick. "So," I said, my voice oddly calm even to my own ears, "what exactly were we planning to list before Christmas?" Karen looked at the manila folder, then at me. Her cheeks flushed. "Mom, I wasn't, it's not like that. We were just talking about possibilities. We don't know how long any of this will, it made us think about arrangements, about what you would want." "I thought I might want to be consulted," I replied. I wasn't shouting. I'd shouted so rarely in my life that my angry voice had never fully grown up. But the words felt firm, like placing plates on a table one by one. Funny thing, surviving. It keeps you available for questions. Dan tugged on his collar and sat back down, almost relieved to have something to do with his hands. "We should give you some space," he murmured, but he didn't stand up to leave. That is my daughter's house habit now, announcing space, while staying exactly where she is. "Mom," Karen said, "please don't do that passive-aggressive thing. You scared us half to death. Of course we started thinking about—" She gestured vaguely toward the walls, the furniture, the framed photos on the mantel. One of them was of her at 12, holding a soccer trophy, cheeks flushed red in the fall cold. Harold had taken that picture. He'd been so proud he printed 3 copies and put one at his work desk. "Thinking about what, exactly?" I asked, stepping closer to the mantel. I traced the edge of the clock with one finger. It was dusty. I'd been away long enough for that, or maybe I just stopped seeing the dust. "The house," she said. "Your things, your money. None of this is easy to talk about, Mom, but we have to be realistic. You're—" She faltered before the word old, and I watched her swallow it back. "You're alone here," she finished instead. "This place is too much. We've talked about that before. It's different now. When they said you were gone, all I could think was, I should have pushed harder for her to move closer. I should have gotten her settled somewhere with help. And then the bank accounts and the will, and I don't want to be scrambling if something happens." "Something did happen," I reminded her gently, "and I handled it. I sat in a field. I climbed out of a broken plane with my own 2 legs. I walked myself into a triage tent. I listened to a very young doctor with freckles explain that my blood pressure was remarkably boring, his words, and that my heart seems to be made of rubber bands. He'd smiled when he said it. "You just bounced, Mrs. Carter," he had added, "like a basketball, bruised but still in the game." At the time I had laughed. Now the metaphor tasted sour and childish in my mouth. "The point is," I went on, "I didn't evaporate. I'm not a painting you have to dust around. I'm still here." Karen sank onto the edge of the couch, the folder abandoned. Her shoulders slumped. "I know," she said, but her voice sounded more like, "I wish that changed anything," than relief. For a moment, guilt pinched at me. I knew some of their situation. Dan's hours had been cut last spring. The kids' braces, the car that needed a new transmission. I had watched them juggling bills under their breath for years now, insisting everything was fine. I knew I was part of the math they did late at night when they thought nobody could hear. I knew that even before a plane fell wrong out of the sky. The first time Karen suggested I sell the house, it had been over coffee at this same table, in June. She'd worn that careful tone she uses on her teenagers. "You could have a nice condo, Mom," she'd said, "with an elevator and a gym and maybe a little book club. You wouldn't have to worry about shoveling or mowing or raccoons in the trash." She'd smiled as if it were a gift. We both pretended to believe that the idea started with my comfort. But I had seen her eyes flick just once to the stack of bills she'd tucked half under her purse. I didn't blame her. Children grow up watching their parents' home like a lighthouse. When the light flickers, everyone panics. Even so, hearing her say, "We can list the house," with the same mouth that used to ask me to braid her hair, that was different. That was a sharpness I didn't know what to do with yet. "What's in the folder?" I asked now, keeping my eyes on the clock. It ticked on, impartial. If Harold were here, he would have taken it down and oiled it, just for something to busy his hands while tempers cooled. Without him, there was nothing between our words but air. "Just notes," Karen muttered. "Information from the internet. I called a senior community while we were waiting for news, just to understand options. And I called your bank. I had that power of attorney packet they mailed you last spring, remember? I thought maybe we should, if you couldn't sign." I remembered. The packet had come in a stiff white envelope with a blue logo, thick paper that smelled faintly of printer ink when I opened it at the kitchen table. I'd called Karen because the language made my eyes blur. She'd sat in this very room and said, "It's just in case, Mom. It's like giving me a spare key, not the whole house." She'd laughed at her own metaphor, and I'd let it soothe me because it sounded simple and loving. We never sent it back because I had time. Time, it turns out, can be shorter than the life of a plane ride. "You didn't sign anything, did you?" I asked, sharper than I meant to. Karen straightened. "No," she said quickly. "I couldn't. They told me I'd need you, or—" She stopped herself. "Or a death certificate." The unspoken words sat between us like another person. "I was just trying to be prepared," she whispered. "I didn't mean you overheard the worst possible sentence. You always do that." "The worst possible sentence tells the truth," I said quietly. "It slips out when people think the door is closed." We looked at each other over the coffee table, the way we used to look over Monopoly boards when she was 10 and determined to beat me. Back then, she'd accuse me of cheating whenever she lost. Now, it seemed, she was prepared to accuse me of living too long. Dan cleared his throat. "Louise, maybe we should all take a breath. You just got home. You've been through a lot. Maybe we order some lunch, let you rest, and talk later when nobody feels like a villain in a TV movie." There it was, the attempt at levity. I appreciated it, in a distant sort of way. "I am tired," I admitted. My knees ached from the bus, and there was a thin film of travel on my skin I wanted to wash off. And I don't think any of us are villains. I think we are just people who are afraid. The clock ticked again. The house smelled like the vanilla candle Karen liked to light when she visited, a scent that never smelled like me. The afternoon light coming through the curtains was thin and pale, making the dust motes glow. My suitcase sat by the door like a question mark. "We'll stop," Karen said finally, pushing the folder away as if it offended her now. "We'll drop everything. I'm just so glad you're here, Mom." She stood up and came toward me with her arms half open. For a second, I let myself imagine leaning into them the way I did when she was 17 and came home crying about a boy. Back then, her hair smelled like drugstore shampoo and hope. Now, it smelled like salon products and stress. I let her hug me, but I kept my arms around her more loosely than usual. It was a small dishonesty and a small protest, both at once. She noticed. Her body stiffened just enough for me to feel it. "Do you want some tea?" she asked, pulling back. "You always want tea after a trip. I can put the kettle on." "I can put my own kettle on," I said, and then softer, because I heard the bitterness in my voice. But yes, tea would be good. Karen walked into the kitchen like she owned the muscles in the walls, opening cabinets, reaching for the mugs I'd had longer than her marriage. I watched her fingers close around the handle of my favorite white mug with the little blue flowers. Harold had bought it at a gas station in Indiana, on a road trip, actually. "It reminded me of your Sunday dress," he'd said at the time. The irony was not lost on me, standing there with Indiana soil probably still in my shoes. Dan sank back onto the couch, rubbing his temples. The manila folder sat untouched now, a mute witness to all the words that had already been said. I walked over to it, my movement slow and careful, like I was approaching a skittish animal. "May I?" I asked. He nodded, looking embarrassed. I opened it. Inside were printouts from websites with smiling gray-haired people sitting by fountains, brochures for independent living communities, and a sheet of notebook paper in Karen's handwriting. On it, she'd listed numbers: estimated sale price of my house, her mortgage payments, college savings for the kids, possible monthly fees for a one-bedroom unit with assisted services available if needed. At the bottom, underlined twice, were the words "peace of mind." I ran my thumb over the ink. The writing was pressed hard into the paper, the way she used to press her pencil when she was learning cursive. Peace of mind for whom, I wondered. I closed the folder and set it down, then glanced up at the clock again. 11:20 now. Time moves even when you feel like your life is hanging on a hook by the door. I realized, with a clarity that startled me, that I was not as angry as I'd expected to be. Hurt, yes. Scraped on the inside, certainly. But underneath, there was something else, a kind of cold, careful awareness. This crash, this almost death of mine, had not created anything new between us. It had only peeled back a layer of politeness and shown me what was already there. Karen's fear, Dan's worry, the way they saw my house not just as a place where I live, but as a solution to their problems, and my own habit of trusting that love would keep everything in its proper drawer without my having to look. "I'm going to wash my face," I said. Then I'd like to sit at my own kitchen table and hear, in complete sentences, what you both think should happen to me while I am alive. After that, we can talk about after. Does that sound reasonable? Dan looked relieved to have instructions. "Yeah," he said quickly. Yeah, that sounds fair. Karen turned from the stove, her hand resting on the kettle. Of course, she said. Whatever you want, Mom. Her words sounded right, but her eyes flickered just once to the manila folder. That tiny movement, that betrayal of a glance, told me her mind was already half in a future where I was a number on a line, where this house was empty, where the clock on the wall might be boxed up or thrown away. I knew, standing there in my own living room with my shoes still on, that I was going to have to do something I had never quite done before. I was going to have to look at my life on paper myself before anyone else sharpened a pencil. In the hallway mirror, as I passed, I caught sight of my reflection, hair flattened from travel, a small bruise under my chin from where someone's elbow had caught me in the chaos of the evacuation. My eyes looked more tired than old. In the background of the mirror, I could see the clock over my shoulder, its round face hovering above me like a patient witness. It had watched us bring babies home. It had watched Harold leave for chemo. It had watched me eat microwave dinners alone. Now it was watching this new thing, me coming back from the dead to find my life already half divided. In the tiny bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and pressed my palms over my eyes until I saw little sparks of light. The house hummed softly around me, the refrigerator motor, the heater clicking on, the distant murmur of Karen's voice as she called someone, probably her sister, or maybe the friend who had texted her about the crash first. I could imagine the whisper, "She's alive. What does this mean now?" I dried my face on the hand towel with the embroidered daisies, another relic of some long-ago church bazaar. Then I stood there for a moment, my hands on the edge of the sink, and made a small, private decision. I would sit at that table and listen. I would let them talk. But for the first time in a long while, I would not assume that their plans automatically became my fate. I would look at that clock, at that key hook, at the worn spot on the floor where Harold used to stand when he carved the Thanksgiving turkey. And I would remember that I have been the keeper of this house longer than anyone else. When I walked back into the living room, the kettle was whistling. The clock read 11:25. Karen had set out 3 mugs. My suitcase still sat by the door, not yet unpacked. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool November air sneak under the window frames, and pulled out a chair at the table. The wood creaked its familiar answer as I sat down, and I realized that, crash or no crash, something in me had shifted just a fraction of an inch, like the minute hand on that clock moving forward when you aren't looking. Karen sat down across from me, her shoulders drawn up toward her ears like she was bracing for bad weather, while Dan hovered at the counter, pretending to be busy with the sugar bowl. For a moment, nobody spoke. The kettle's fading whine and the little tick of the clock filled the space between us like 2 old friends watching a new argument. I stirred my tea slowly, listening to the spoon touch the sides of the mug, needing that small, ordinary sound to remind me I was still here in my own kitchen, not in some strange alternate version of my life where I was only a name on a list. Karen wrapped both hands around her mug, even though she always said she didn't like drinks too hot. "Okay," she said finally, taking a breath. "You said you wanted complete sentences. So," she looked up at me, and for a heartbeat, I saw the little girl who used to sit at this table doing homework, tongue stuck out in concentration as she tried to divide fractions. I'm scared you're going to get hurt, Mom. That's the first sentence. I nodded slowly. That one I can understand, I said. The second? She swallowed. I can't keep up with everything, she admitted, voice quieter. The kids, work, money. Worrying about you, alone in this house, feels like one more thing I might drop. I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking about you slipping in the shower or the furnace going out and me not knowing until it's too late. Her eyes shone the way they used to when she got overtired as a child and insisted she wasn't. I don't want to find out something happened because a neighbor calls me and says, "We haven't seen your mom in days." I would never forgive myself. There was love in that, twisted up with fear like vines around a fence. I could recognize it, even if it stung that her solution to loving me was to rearrange my life like furniture. So, your solution was to practice being relieved if I died? I asked, not unkindly. Because that sentence I overheard, Karen, it didn't sound like someone drowning in sorrow. It sounded like relief. She flinched, but she didn't look away. I was a mess at first, she said, a little defensively. You weren't here. You didn't see it. I cried so hard I thought I'd throw up. The kids were terrified. We stayed glued to the TV for hours, hoping they'd say, "Oh, we were wrong. Everyone walked away." They never did. It was only after it sank in that you might really be gone that I started thinking about practical things. I know it sounds awful, but that's how my brain works. When something scares me, I start making lists. It's like, if I can put it in columns, I won't fall apart. Dan cleared his throat. She did cry, he said softly. A lot. We both did, but the kids still needed dinner, the electricity bill still came, and the questions were still there. The house, the accounts, the everything. We thought we were dealing with your absence. That doesn't mean we wanted it. I believed him. I believed both of them. But belief didn't erase the way the words had sounded through the door, the casual cruelty of, we can't leave everything sitting here forever, when everything was my whole life. I cupped my mug, letting the heat seep into my fingers. You know what I was thinking about, I said, when I thought I might actually die. Not the house, not the accounts, not whether you'd have to mow the lawn without me. I was thinking about how we haven't gone grocery shopping together in 3 years. Karen blinked, startled. What? Grocery shopping, I repeated. Do you remember how we used to do that after your divorce? I'd pick you up from work and we'd wander the aisles, throw things in the cart we didn't need, and talk about your day. It wasn't special, not really, but I remember feeling useful. You'd ask what kind of pasta to buy or how to pick a good melon. I'd watch you hold jars up to the light like your father did. That's what I thought of, not Will's. She looked down into her tea, the surface of it trembling just slightly in her hands. I remember, she said. I miss that too. Life just changed. It always does, I said. That's why we have clocks, isn't it? To mark the changes. My eyes drifted up to the one on the wall. The crack in the glass caught a strip of pale November light. For a second, the little hairline fracture glowed, a tiny white scar on the smooth face. Karen followed my gaze and then looked quickly away, like the clock had caught her eye in something private. I didn't mean to sound happy, she whispered, about the house. I was numb and exhausted, and maybe a little bitter that it took a tragedy for us to talk about things we should have discussed years ago. That was fair. We should have talked earlier. I had put off conversations too because they felt like admitting defeat, as if saying, "When I die," out loud, might invite it. "We're talking now," I said, "so let's use it. Tell me what you actually think should happen, not because you thought I was gone, but because I'm still here." Dan looked at Karen, and something passed between them, a silent question about who would go first. It reminded me of the way they silently decide which one will argue with their teenagers over curfew. Finally, Karen sighed. "I think you should sell the house, move into a place where you have help close by, and let us manage the money," she said, words coming out in a rush, like she'd practiced them in the shower. "Not because we want your things, but because I'm scared that if we don't do something, the decision will get made for us by some emergency." She fidgeted with the handle of her mug. "I also think," she added quietly, "that you're more fragile than you let on. And I don't know how to say that without sounding like I'm calling you weak." Something in me bristled, ready to deny fragility with every bone. But I made myself sit with it for a moment. My body did hurt more now than it used to. The bus ride had left my back aching. The crash had left bruises in places I didn't know could bruise. My hands shook a little sometimes when I poured tea. These things were true. "And what do you think you get out of that arrangement?" I asked. "Besides my safety." Karen's face flushed again, high along her cheekbones. "Less worry," she said. "Less driving back and forth. Maybe a little financial breathing room. Yes, I won't pretend that doesn't matter. But mostly I like the idea of you being somewhere where, if you fall, there's a nurse, not an empty room. And you?" I turned to Dan. He scratched his jaw. "Honestly?" he asked. "Preferably," I replied. "I like the idea of you not having to shovel snow," he said, gesturing toward the window. Outside, the sky was a dull metal gray, the kind that promised snow sooner or later. And I like the idea of knowing that if something happens, we're not trying to figure out mortgage paperwork while planning a funeral. I watched my sister go through that with my dad, and it was ugly. He hesitated, then added, I think about college for the kids, about debt, about being in our 40s and still feeling like we're one disaster from losing everything. It's not that we want something from you. It's that you have something that could help all of us. And once that thought shows up, it just sits there." His honesty hurt and relieved me at the same time. Being seen as an asset instead of just a person felt bad. Knowing he had the courage to say it out loud felt almost respectful in a backward way. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for saying that part. I would rather know where I stand in your mind than guess." Karen shot him a look, but she didn't contradict him. She only sighed and rubbed at her temples. "We're not vultures," she said to me. "It feels like that when you say it back, like some greedy caricature in a movie. But that's not us. I bring you soup when you're sick. I take you to the doctor. I'm here because I love you, not because I have a tally sheet hidden in my purse." I believed that too. Love and fear and need can all live in the same room. I'd seen it in my own marriage. When Harold's factory closed and he spent 6 months unemployed, I watched the pride in him wrestle with worry every time we paid a bill. We'd sat at this same table counting out cash in little stacks. "If we don't pay the gas, we can't cook," he'd said. "If we don't pay the car loan, I can't go to interviews." We'd chosen heat over headlights 1 month. The house had stayed warm. The car had nearly been taken. Life had been a series of those decisions. I knew what it was to look at someone you love and see both a person and the shape of your survival. Do you remember when we almost lost the house in '89? I asked suddenly. Karen frowned, thrown. I was a kid, she said. I remember you and Dad fighting more. And I remember getting free lunch at school for a while, but I don't remember details. That's good, I said. I tried to keep you out of it, but we came close, one lost paycheck away. I traced the edge of my mug. We didn't put you up for sale. We didn't say, if we take on a boarder, that might solve things. We made sacrifices, and we asked for help where we could. We found a way that didn't turn our daughter into a line item. That's all I'm asking for now, that if we are going to talk about using my house and my savings to help, we do it in a way that doesn't erase me. Karen's eyes filled, finally spilling over. One tear, then another, tracking through the makeup at the corners of her eyes. I don't want to erase you, she said thickly. I want you for as long as I can have you. I feel like I'm drowning, Mom. And I looked at your neat little bills and your paid-off house, and I thought, why does she get to sit in safety while I'm counting coupons? And then I hated myself for that thought, but it was already there. The ugly truth of it hung in the air, raw and honest. Part of me wanted to rush in and comfort her, say it was okay, that I understood. Another part of me, quieter and stronger than I remembered, held back. Thank you for telling me the worst thought, I said instead. Most people never do that. They just act on it and pretend they were noble the whole time. Dan looked at me with something like respect in his eyes. So, what do you think should happen? He asked. If you had a magic wand. If I had a magic wand, I'd give you both jobs that paid what you're worth and an economy that didn't punish anyone for getting sick, I said dryly. Short of that. I sighed and looked again at the clock, as if it might whisper an answer. Its hands had crept closer to noon, resolute. Short of that, I think I need to understand exactly where I stand. Not just stories and fears, numbers, papers, what I own, what I owe, what my options really are. I've left too much of it in a file drawer because it scared me. Karen sniffed and reached for a tissue from the little floral box I kept by the salt and pepper. We've tried to talk about it, she said. You get overwhelmed. I get overwhelmed when you talk at me, I corrected gently. And when I feel like the conclusion has already been written, I need to hear from someone who doesn't stand to gain or lose based on where I sleep. The idea had been forming in the back of my mind ever since the nurse at the hospital had said, you should talk to someone about making a plan. It's easier when you're the one writing it. At the time, I'd nodded, too tired to think. Now the suggestion stood up and stretched in my memory. A lawyer? Dan asked. Or a financial person? I shrugged. Maybe both, I said. A grown-up, since apparently we're all struggling to feel like grown-ups here. That drew a small, surprised laugh from Karen, which loosened something in my chest. I can come with you, she said immediately, wiping her nose. I can help ask questions, explain things. You know this stuff makes your eyes glaze over. It's a lot of terms. I know, I said, and I appreciate that. But I think I need to talk to someone first by myself. Her face fell a little. You don't trust me, she said. It wasn't a question, but I answered it anyway. "I trust that you love me," I said carefully. "I trust that you're scared. I trust that you're not a villain rubbing your hands together in my living room. But trust about money and power and decisions, that has to be built, Karen. And you started using it without finishing building it. That doesn't mean it's gone. It means we have work to do. Together. After I understand what's on the table." I watched those words land. She looked at the folder again, then at me. "What if the lawyer tells you the same thing we're saying?" she asked, a little defiantly. "That selling is your best option?" "Then I'll know I'm not just hearing your exhaustion and resentment in a different accent," I said. "And I'll make a decision. Maybe the same one you want. Maybe a different one." I thought of the plane again, the way the pilot's voice had come over the intercom, steady but a shade too high, telling us we were making an unscheduled landing and to brace. We'd had to follow instructions in that moment. There was no time for debate. This was not a crashing plane. This was my life. I had time to ask the pilot's name before I handed over the controls. Karen picked at a crumb on the table. "When would you go?" she asked. "To see someone." "Soon," I said, "before the memory of hearing you at that door fades enough that I start making excuses for everybody again." My own bluntness startled me a little. It startled them, too. I saw it. There, under the shock and the guilt and the fatigue, there was a flash of something else in Karen's eyes. Wariness, maybe. Or the realization that the version of me who came back from the cornfield was not exactly the one who'd left. "I can call Mrs. Avery," I added, more gently. "The neighbor 3 doors down. Her son's a lawyer, remember? He helped her with her estate when Mr. Avery passed. She always says he's good but not fancy, which is exactly what I want." "I didn't know you'd talked to her about that," Karen said, surprised. "I haven't," I admitted. "I just listen when she talks on the sidewalk. It's amazing what you can learn from people's throwaway comments if you're not in a rush." Dan smiled faintly. "You're good at that," he said. "Listening." "It's kept me alive this long," I replied. I didn't mention that it had also meant I'd heard my daughter trying to sell my future along with my furniture. The clock chimed noon in its soft, slightly off-key way, the little mechanical sound vibrating through the room. We all fell silent for its duration, as if it were conducting a moment of not quite prayer. When it finished, I felt oddly steadier. The same way I had as a girl when the school bell rang and I knew the class had to move on, whether we were ready or not. "I'm glad you didn't die," Karen blurted suddenly, as if the clock's chime had shaken it out of her. "I don't think I said that clearly enough yet. I am so glad you're here, Mom, even if it complicates everything." There it was, the messy truth. Life with me breathing was harder, in some ways, than life with me as a settled estate. I let that hurt, and then let it just be a fact. "I am glad I'm here too," I said, "and I would prefer our relationship not to be framed as a complication, but I appreciate the honesty." Karen winced, then nodded. "I'm not always good at saying things the gentle way," she admitted. "I get sharp. You used to tell me that when I was a teenager. Your tongue has elbows, remember?" I did remember. I'd said it once when she snapped at her brother over the remote control. She'd stomped off to her room. Later, I'd found her drawing in her notebook a little cartoon of a tongue with pointy elbows, grinning. She'd shown it to me, and we'd both laughed until we cried. Your tongue still has elbows, I said, but my voice held a smile this time. You've just learned to hide them under a cardigan. She huffed a wet laugh at that, swiping at her eyes again. Dan stood up and started clearing the mugs. The familiar domestic rhythm soothed me, his footsteps, the clink of ceramic against the sink, the rush of the faucet. For a moment, it almost felt normal, like any other Sunday lunch, except my suitcase, the manila folder, and the bruise under my chin insisted that it was not. "Do you want us to stay?" Karen asked. "Or would you rather have the afternoon to yourself?" It was a small question, but it held a bigger one. Are we part of your safety right now, or part of the danger? I surprised myself by answering quickly. "I'd like you to go home after we eat something," I said, keeping my tone kind. "You've had 3 weeks of grieving and worrying and making lists. I've had 3 weeks of being poked and scanned and told to rest. We all need to lie down in our own noise for a bit." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. Boundaries, small but noticeable, were sliding into place like chairs around a table. "Okay," she said, "but call me if you need anything. Anything at all." "I will," I said. And I meant it, more than I had before, because I was already forming the next step in my mind, and it didn't involve shutting her out entirely. It just involved driving the car myself, metaphorically and literally, at least one more time. After they left, after Karen hugged me too tightly at the door and Dan patted my shoulder, after the kids came in from school and screamed when they saw me, hugging me as if they thought I might vanish if they let go. The house settled back into itself with a long exhale. I stood in the entryway, listening to the quiet expand. The clock ticked on, undeterred, its sound now the loudest thing in the room. I took my key down from the hook and turned it over in my hand, feeling the grooves under my fingertips. Harold had always said a key was a promise. "You only give someone a key," he told Karen the day she moved into her first apartment, "if you're okay with them walking in when you're in your underwear." She'd laughed and rolled her eyes, but she'd understood. A house key was trust. So were bank cards, passwords, signatures. I'd been handing out promises for years without always reading the fine print in my own heart. I hung the key back on its hook and went to find the little address book in the desk drawer, the one with curling pages and phone numbers crossed out as people moved or died or decided they didn't want to be known anymore. Mrs. Avery's son's number was printed there in her careful slanted handwriting. She'd insisted on writing it herself after she'd come over with a plate of lemon bars and a lecture about the importance of not leaving everything to chance. At the time, I'd smiled and promised to call someday. Someday had been politely standing in the doorway for a while now. It was time to invite it in. I ran my fingertip along the numbers, then closed the book without dialing. Not yet. The crash had taught me one thing. Don't call anyone important when you're still shaking. I'd wait until morning when the light came in slanting through the kitchen window and the coffee tasted like the start of a plan instead of a patch over panic. For now, I went back into the living room and stood beneath the clock. It ticked above me, oblivious, the minute hand already nudging past 12. I studied it, thinking of how many arguments and reconciliations it had listened to without taking sides. "You're going to see a lot more of me," I muttered to it, as if it cared. Alive. Its second hand kept moving. I took that as agreement. Then, with a little more resolve in my spine than I'd had an hour earlier, I went to unpack my suitcase, knowing that the clothes I folded into my drawers were not the only things I intended to put back in their rightful places. I started with the smallest things, the way I always have when life feels too large, rolling socks into pairs, smoothing sweaters that still smelled faintly of the fabric softener I like, and Karen says is too old-fashioned. The motions calmed my hands, even as my mind kept jumping back to the image of her palm on the clock, like she could just lift time off the wall when it became inconvenient. I put my toiletries back in the bathroom cabinet, lined them up the way I liked: face cream, aspirin, Harold's old cologne bottle that I still kept because the smell was almost gone, and somehow that felt worse than the grief. I left the suitcase empty on the bed for a moment, staring at it. The last thing I took out was the small hospital pamphlet they'd tucked into my discharge folder, the one with advanced planning in cheerful blue letters across the front. I set it on my nightstand and turned the lamp on, though there was still daylight, wanting the light on my side. By evening, the house looked almost like it had before I left, except for the errant manila folder still on the coffee table, and the new thin layer of knowledge stretched over everything. I moved through my routines almost on autopilot. A simple dinner, a phone call from Karen, "Just checking you're okay, Mom," and a too late text from my grandson with a string of emojis he probably thought would make me smile. I did smile, a little. Then the house settled into night sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the furnace kicking on and off. I lay in bed and listened to the clock faintly ticking down the hall, the sound filtered through the partially open door. When I closed my eyes, the tick-tick blended with the remembered thud-thud of my heart when the plane had first lurched. For the first time since the landing, I let myself cry properly, not the quiet, embarrassed tears I'd shed in the hospital bathroom, but a deeper, older grief, not just for the crash, but for all the little ruptures that had led to the moment on my porch. I cried for the girl I'd been when we first bought this house, the way my whole body had thrilled to the sound of the key turning that first time. I cried for Harold not being here to roll his eyes and say, "Well, Lou, turns out you're hardier than you look." I cried for my daughter, who had been both orphan and opportunist for 3 terrible weeks. When the tears finally slowed, the clock was still ticking. Time does not stop for anyone's private storm. I slept in odd, shallow increments, waking at every car that passed or gust of wind that rattled the old windows. Once, I dreamed I was back on the plane, but instead of a flight attendant, it was Karen walking down the aisle with a clipboard, asking each passenger to initial beside the word surrender. I woke up with my heart slamming, had to put my hand flat on my chest and whisper, "You're in your bed, Louise, you're in your own bed," until my body believed me. Morning finally came in thin, watery light through the slats of the blinds. Ohio. November mornings never look particularly eager. The sky was a flat slab of cloud, and the tree in the front yard had given up the last of its leaves overnight, leaving its branches bare and a little accusatory. Still, there is a particular comfort in the ordinary rituals of starting a day. I shuffled into the kitchen in my robe, turned on the coffee maker, and stood for a moment watching it gurgle. The smell of brewing coffee might be the closest thing I have to a spiritual experience now. As it filled the pot, I looked up at the clock. 7:12. The hands were exactly where I expected them to be, like a loyal dog returning to the same spot at the foot of the bed. You and me today, I murmured. We're making some calls. I took my first sip of coffee, too hot, burning the tip of my tongue just enough to prove I was awake, and then went to the desk in the little room we'd once called the den. The address book waited there, still open to the page with Mrs. Avery's son's number. My fingers hovered over the phone for a second. There is a certain courage involved in dialing numbers that might change your life, even if it's just a 10-digit row of ink. Finally, I punched them in. The line rang 3 times before a woman answered, brisk but not unkind. "Avery Law," she said. "This is Amanda." "Good morning," I replied. My voice sounded older than I felt inside. "My name is Louise Carter. I live on Mapleview, 3 doors down from Mrs. Avery. Her son helped her with some arrangements a while back. She said I could call." "Oh, of course, Miss Carter," the woman said, her tone warming immediately. "Yes, Jacob mentioned you might reach out someday. How can we help?" Someday. It was oddly comforting to know that someone else had been holding that word for. Me too. "Well," I said, "I had a bit of a scare, let's call it. And I realized I don't have the faintest idea where I truly stand when it comes to my house, my accounts, all the important things people argue about when someone dies. Except I didn't die. I'm very much alive, which seems like a good time to get my head on straight." Amanda let out a short little laugh, not mocking, more like she appreciated the joke. "We like our clients alive, Miss Carter," she said. "Jacob can absolutely sit down with you and go through everything. Would you like to make an appointment?" We settled on Thursday morning. "He'll explain everything in plain English," she added. "He's good at that. Says legalese is like a foreign language, and half his job is translating." "Plain English would be lovely," I said. "My daughter speaks fluent Panic, which is a dialect of its own." "We hear that one a lot, too," she replied. After I hung up, I sat there for a minute, staring at the phone. My heart was fluttering like a bird against a window. It wasn't just about the appointment. Calling on my own, without asking Karen's permission or inviting her in, felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of something I hadn't realized I'd been handing over all these years. I looked over at the clock through the doorway. Its hands had crept to 7:20. Time had moved in those 8 minutes, but in a way that felt different now, as if I were the one choosing how to use it. The day passed in small domestic tasks, the kind of things that don't look like much from the outside. Laundry, a quick vacuum, writing a grocery list, but add up to a person's sense of competence. At one point, I caught myself reaching for the step stool to dust the top of the bookcase and stopped. Maybe I didn't need to court gravity just to prove I could. I settled for wiping the lower shelves and felt a small satisfaction at choosing caution on my own terms, rather than because someone scolded me. In the afternoon, the doorbell rang. I peeked through the front window and saw Mrs. Avery, bundled in her pink coat, her white hair like a halo of cotton candy. She held a Tupperware container in both hands, like an offering. When I opened the door, her eyes scanned my face, sharp despite the way her lids drooped a little with age. "You look too good for someone who's supposed to be dead," she announced, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. "I brought chicken pot pie. Death or near death, it seems appropriate." I laughed, the sound surprising me with its volume. "Good morning to you too, Helen," I said. Come in before the heat escapes. My ghost will be annoyed if it has to shiver." She sniffed, amused, and shuffled into the kitchen. I followed, watching her eyes flick over the room. Some people snoop, some people just take in their surroundings as naturally as breathing. Helen was the latter. She noticed the manila folder on the coffee table, the hospital pamphlet on the counter, the way my address book lay open on the desk with a pen across it. Her gaze lingered briefly on the clock, and she made a little sound. "That thing still ticking?" she asked. "I swear I've had at least 3 husbands since you moved in, and that clock hasn't missed a beat." "It's loyal," I said. "I like that about it." "You and me both," she replied dryly, setting the Tupperware on the counter with a soft thud. "So, you gonna tell me why half the block thinks you're a miracle, and the other half thinks they got the wrong Louise on the news?" So I did. I told her about the tickets, about how I'd changed flights at the last minute because my left knee was acting up and I didn't want the longer layover. I told her about the field in Indiana, about the nurses, about the quiet. I told her in a careful, abridged way about standing on my own porch and hearing my daughter's voice talk about listing my house as if I were an old couch finally out of the way. Helen listened without interrupting, her expression tightening in places, relaxing in others. When I got to the part about calling her son's office, she nodded, as if she'd expected it. "Good," she said simply. "You need someone in your corner who doesn't share your blood or your bills." "Is that how you'd describe Jacob?" I asked, pouring us both coffee. She smiled, the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes deepening. "He's a decent man," she said. "Too fond of paperwork, but that's his job. When Harold died, you remember, I almost signed the whole house over to my niece because she cried the loudest at the funeral." She shook her head. "Jacob sat me down and said, 'Mom, grief makes bad negotiators. We're going to slow down and read every line.' He has a way of making you feel like you still own your life, even if you've dropped it on the floor. That image, owning your life but dropping it, and someone helping you pick it up piece by piece, lodged in my heart." "I'm afraid," I admitted. "Not of death, oddly. That feels less hypothetical now than it used to, but also less mysterious. I'm afraid of being managed, of waking up one day in a place that echoes with other people's decisions and realizing my house is gone and I was the last to know." Helen sipped her coffee. "You know what my mother used to say?" she asked. "Silence is a kind of consent. If you don't speak up, people will assume you agree, especially if it makes their life easier." She glanced at the clock again. "You've been quiet a long time, Louise. It's no wonder your girl started thinking she could rearrange the furniture." "I didn't want to be a burden," I protested, hearing the thinness in my own voice. "They have so much going on. I thought I was helping by not adding my worries to theirs." Helen's look was surprisingly sharp. "And how's that working out?" she asked. I stared into my mug. "Apparently," I said slowly, "it earns you a starring role in someone else's financial strategy." She hummed. "My Toby tried that once, after I fell last winter. Came over with brochures and big eyes. 'Mom, we're just thinking about your comfort,' he said, as if I hadn't been comfortable in my own bed for 30 years. She snorted. Turned out his wife had her eye on our guest room for her, she said, crafts business or whatever nonsense." "What did you do?" I asked. "I told them I was willing to talk about options," she said, "but only after I knew what my options really were. not just the ones that suited their plans. That's when I called Jacob. He explained things like I was a reasonably intelligent adult instead of an expired coupon. Then I went back to Toby and said, "Here is what I'm prepared to do," not, "What are you going to do with me?" Small difference in words, big difference in backbone. I smiled despite myself. "Expired coupon?" "That's how they make you feel, sometimes," she said, not unkindly. "Useful once, then tucked away, until someone decides to clean out the drawer." She reached across the table and patted my hand. Her skin was thin and dry, her nails neatly trimmed. "You are not expired, Louise. You survived a plane crash. That should automatically earn you one very loud say in your future." The phrasing made me laugh, but it also warmed something inside me that had been cold since the crash. We talked a little longer about practical things, what questions to ask Jacob, what papers to gather. Deed, bank statements, any insurance policies. That old will you and Harold made when the kids were little, she listed, counting on her fingers. Bring it all, even the stuff you think is irrelevant. Let him sift. When she stood to leave, she paused under the clock. "You know," she said, tilting her head, "when Mr. Avery died, I thought about taking hours down. Too many memories, I told myself. But then I realized the tick was the only thing that sounded the same as before. Everything else had changed, so I left it. Sometimes you need one stubborn object to remind you that you've seen hard days and survived them." After she left, I looked at my own clock with new eyes. It had watched me survive more than I'd given it credit for. Now it was watching me try to think like the kind of woman who didn't hand her future over in a manila envelope. Over the next 2 days, I went through drawers and file boxes. The important papers drawer in the desk yielded a nest of envelopes, some still sealed, some opened and smoothed, some repurposed for shopping lists. I found the old will Helen had mentioned, from when the kids were in elementary school. Harold's handwriting looked back at me from the signature line, steady and decisive. We'd left everything to each other then, with a neat clause about the children if we died together. It felt almost quaint now, like a relic from a time when the worst thing we could imagine was a car accident. My life had become more complicated than those simple lines could contain. I stacked the documents in a tidy pile on the dining table. Deed, will, bank statements, the letter from the pension fund, the health care proxy form I'd filled out after Harold's chemo started. For a moment, looking at the pile, I felt exposed, as if I'd taken my insides out and arranged them under bright lights. I also felt oddly proud. This was my life on paper. Imperfect, but mine. Wednesday evening, Karen called. Her name lit up on the landline caller ID. I still keep the landline. She's always threatening to cancel it. And I picked up after 2 rings. "Hi, Mom," she said. Her voice had that careful tone, like she was approaching an animal that might bite. "How are you feeling today?" "Like a woman who spent too much time reading small print," I said lightly. "How are you?" "Busy," she sighed. "The kids have projects. There's a fundraiser at school. I had 3 patients go off their meds this week and decide I'm personally responsible for the pharmaceutical industry." She works as a nurse at a clinic. Sometimes I think she absorbs everyone's chaos like a sponge. "And my mother came back from the dead and yelled at me," she added, only half joking. "I didn't yell," I protested. "I used my serious voice." "We're not used to that voice from you," she said, with a little laugh that sounded like it hurt. "Look, Mom, I've been thinking about what you said about trust. I I get it. I don't like how it makes me feel, but I get it. I appreciated that admission. I've been thinking too, I said. I made an appointment with a lawyer, Mrs. Avery's son, for tomorrow. There was a pause, just long enough for me to imagine the expressions crossing her face. Without me? She said finally. No accusation exactly, just surprise. At first, yes, I answered. I need to hear things with my own ears before I hear them translated through yours. If, after that, it seems useful for you to join, we can talk about it. Another stretch of silence. I could hear her breathing. Okay, she said, to my mild shock. Okay, that's fair. I don't love it, but it's fair. Will you at least tell me what he says? If I understand it, I said dryly. You know my relationship with jargon. She chuckled despite herself. Take notes, she advised, and don't let him rush you. You sound like you're sending me off to college, I said. In a way, I guess I am, she replied. Estate planning college. I could hear the smile in her voice now. Just promise me you won't sign anything you're unsure about. The irony of her saying that, given the folder on my table, did not escape either of us. It hung there between us, heavy and almost funny. I promise, I said. I might bring the clock with me as a chaperone. You and that clock, she said, rolling her eyes in my imagination. Ever since I was a kid, you've been yelling at us to listen for it. You'll be late if you don't listen to the clock. I swear that tick is the soundtrack of my childhood. Her words warmed me in a place I hadn't known was cold. And here you are, I said softly, still trying to move faster than it. I have to, she said quietly. I have to move fast to stay afloat. There wasn't much to say to that. The world had not been kind to her generation, and I knew it. Maybe, I said carefully, this is a chance for us to figure out how not to drown each other while we're all flailing. Yeah, she murmured. Maybe. That night, sleep came a little easier. In the morning, I dressed in my good slacks and the soft blue sweater Harold always said made my eyes look less tired. I stood in front of the hallway mirror and checked my reflection the way I used to when I still had somewhere fancy to go. My hair was thinner, my jawline softer, but my eyes looked alert, decided. I put on the watch Karen had given me last year, even though I rarely wore it. It felt fitting to have more than one timekeeper with me today. Before I left, I stood under the clock again. The hands pointed to 9:05. I reached up and adjusted it just a hair forward. It had been losing a minute or two a week lately. No dawdling, I told it and myself. The drive to the law office was uneventful, which I appreciated. One dramatic transit experience per month is more than enough. The firm occupied a narrow brick building on the main street, sandwiched between a hair salon and a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon, and something just a little too sweet. The sign on the door was modest. Avery Law, Estates and Families. I liked that order. Families after estates, as if they understood that paper and people were tangled. Inside, the waiting room was small and neat. A plant in the corner. A few magazines from the last year, which is rarer than you'd think. The clock in here was digital, its red numbers too bright. My eyes wandered back to the analog one in my mind, with its chipped frame and steady tick. Amanda, the woman from the phone, greeted me warmly and handed me a clipboard. Forms, of course. Always forms. I filled them out slowly, careful not to let impatience make my handwriting sloppy. When she finally ushered me into Jacob's office, I had to bite back the urge to call him young man. Everyone looks young when you're 72, but he could have been my Karen's age. "Mrs. Carter," he said, standing up to shake my hand. His grip was firm but not crushing, and his eyes were kind. There were lines at the corners already, from squinting over documents or maybe just from laughing. "I'm glad you came in." "I'm glad your mother feeds me," I replied, "or I might never have known you exist." He smiled. "She feeds half the neighborhood," he said. "Please, have a seat. Amanda said you had a interesting few weeks." I sat, smoothing my slacks, and placed the folder of my own documents on his desk. "You could say that," I replied. "I almost died. Then I didn't. My daughter mourned me, then started planning how to use what I'd leave behind. I came home to find my life half inventoried. I'd like to understand what's mine to decide before someone else writes the ending." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "That's a lot," he said. "I'm sorry you went through all of it, but I'm glad you're here. And you're doing this at a very good time. People usually only come see me after the crisis, when we have nothing but damage control. You still have choices." The word choices felt like a warm blanket on my shoulders. "I'd like to have as many as possible," I said, "but I also don't want the choices to eat my children alive." He leaned back in his chair slightly, steepling his fingers, but not in that pompous way some professionals do, more like he was practicing being patient. "The way I usually explain this," he said, "is that your life, your house, your money, your decisions, is a house with many doors. Right now, it sounds like most of those doors are closed, simply because no one's bothered to open them and look. Your daughter, in her fear, is rattling the one labeled 'Sell Everything' because she can see it, and it looks like an exit. My job is to walk you through the hallway and show you what's behind the other doors, so you're not making decisions in the dark." The image settled in nicely alongside the clock in my mind. A hallway of doors, each with consequences behind it. "I like hallways, I know," I said, "so show me." We spent the next hour going through my papers. He asked straightforward questions, gave little hums of acknowledgement, scribbled notes. When he explained things, he kept the metaphors coming, just like Amanda promised. "Think of a will as instructions you leave in the mailbox of the future," he said at one point. "If you don't put anything in the mailbox, the state drops in a generic flyer and your family has to live with it." When we discussed power of attorney, he said, "That's like giving someone a spare key, not just to your house, but to your wallet. You need to choose someone who will only come in when invited and won't rearrange your furniture while you're asleep." That one made me smile wryly. "I had that envelope from the bank," I admitted. "My daughter was very keen on me signing it. We never sent it back." "I'm glad," he said gently. "Not because it's a bad idea in theory, but because in your situation, it sounds like we need to be thoughtful about how much access we give and when." He sketched a few scenarios on a yellow pad, little boxes with arrows. "There are ways to structure things so that you have help without handing the steering wheel over entirely. It's not all or nothing." As he talked, I noticed my shoulders relaxing. No one had ever laid out my life like this before, not even Harold, who always took charge of the big decisions as if it were his job and my job was to trust him. I realized, with a small twist of guilt and relief, that I'd been content to let men drive for most of my life, both literally and figuratively. Now, here I was, a widow in her 70s, learning the controls for the first time. At one point, Jacob paused and looked at me directly. "Can I ask?" he said. "What you want, not what your daughter wants, not what you think you should want, but what you, sitting here, would prefer if money and guilt weren't screaming in your ear." The question sat between us, big and heavy. I stared at the plant in the corner for a moment, its leaves glossy and oblivious. "I want to stay in my house," I said finally. "For now. I'm not naive. I know there may come a time when that isn't safe or reasonable, but I don't want to leap out of it just because I saw what almost happened to me and scared my children. I'd rather plan for how to make staying possible while I can, and I don't want my staying to ruin them." "That's a good starting point," he said. "We can work from there. A lot of this will be about setting expectations, for you and for them. Maybe we adjust beneficiaries. Maybe we set up a trust that releases things in stages. Maybe we update your will to reflect the reality of your relationship now, not the way it was when your kids were 10. I thought of the old will with its tidy, equal shares and unspoken assumption that our family would always feel like a single unit, not a cluster of individuals with separate storms. "Is it wrong," I asked slowly, "to consider not treating them all exactly the same? My son doesn't ask for a thing. My daughter asks for many things she calls help. I love them both, but the way they carry responsibility is not the same." His expression didn't change, which I appreciated. "Fair doesn't always mean equal," he said. "You're allowed to take into account who's shown up, who's taken advantage, who's vulnerable. The law doesn't require you to pretend everyone behaved the same." The idea was startling. I'd grown up with the notion that good mothers don't play favorites etched into my bones. But favorites and fairness, I realized, were not identical twins. "However," he added, "if you do make choices that might be read as unequal, it's often helpful to leave some kind of explanation. A letter, even. It doesn't have to be an apology, just context. Otherwise, people fill in the blanks with their worst fears. A letter to the future, taped to my own decisions." The thought of writing it made my stomach flutter, but in a way that felt more like anticipation than dread. By the time our hour was nearly up, my head was buzzing. Jacob sensed it. "I don't want to drown you in information," he said. "Why don't we pause here? I'll summarize what we discussed in a letter you can read at home. We can schedule another appointment to actually draft documents once you've had time to breathe. For today, I wanted you to walk out, knowing that you are not trapped between do nothing and hope, and sign everything over in a panic. There's a middle ground." I stood, feeling both lighter and heavier. "Thank you," I said. I was starting to think my only options were those two doors. He smiled. "Most people do, until someone points out the hallway, and having a near-death experience tends to throw everyone into the nearest door, not the best one." On my way out, I stopped in the waiting room to put my coat on. Amanda glanced up. "How'd it go?" she asked. "I didn't sign away my house or my organs," I said, "so I'd call that a success." She laughed. "Low bar, but we'll take it," she said. The drive home felt different from the drive there. I noticed things I usually ignore, the way the bare trees lined up against the gray sky like careful pen strokes, the little dog in a sweater trotting beside its owner, the teenagers hunched against the cold at the bus stop, their breath puffing out like small, annoyed clouds. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, looking at my house, the beige siding, the slightly crooked shutters, the porch where I'd stood 2 days ago listening to my daughter's voice from the other side of the door. It looked the same. I did not feel the same. Inside, the clock greeted me with its habitual tick, as if to say, "You went out. You came back. I kept watch." I took off my coat and hung it on the hook by the door, my hand automatically brushing the key. I thought of Jacob's metaphor. Spare keys, furniture rearranged while you sleep. I thought of the fact that for now, this was still my only key, my only house, my only life. I stood there in the hallway longer than usual, looking at the clock, the key, the manila folder still on the table. For the first time in days, I didn't feel like an object being moved. I felt like a person about to make a move. I didn't know yet exactly what shape that move would take, but I knew this. The next conversation with Karen would not be her telling me what she'd decided in my absence. It would be me laying out what I had learned in my presence. And standing there under the steady tick of the clock, I realized that this shift, this tiny rebalancing of who spoke first, might be the quietest but most important aftershock of the crash. In the weeks after, life didn't turn into a neat little movie, but it did start to feel more like a book I was actually writing, instead of one being skimmed for the ending. And that was enough for me. The meetings with Jacob turned into papers with my name on them in ink I'd read, willed, and chosen, not just signed at the bottom like a child's permission slip. One chilly December afternoon, Karen sat at my kitchen table with those same papers spread out between us, chewing her lip as she read the parts that mattered to her, to all of us. "So you're really setting it up this way," she said, tapping the page where my house was described. Every wall, every square foot of beige siding boiled down into numbers and clauses. You keep the house as long as you want, and if you decide to move later, the money goes into that trust Jacob talked about. And then we don't touch anything unless you're gone, or you tell us to. Her voice wobbled a little on that last word, like she could hear her own elbows on her tongue. "That's the idea," I said quietly, feeling the weight of it and the lightness at the same time. "The trust isn't a tip jar. It's not for emergencies you don't tell me about. If you need help while I'm alive, you ask me like a person, not like a bank that left the vault open." She winced because it was fair, and then nodded. "And the power of attorney," she said, pointing to another section. "It's only for medical decisions if you're not able, and only for bills if Jacob signs off first, so I can't just move things around." "Exactly," I replied. "You're the one I want arguing with a doctor if I can't speak, not the one deciding I'm too much trouble while I'm standing right here." We both let that sit. The memory of her voice through the door, still a ghost between us, but not as sharp now, more like an ache you've finally stopped pretending not to feel. Outside, the sky was the flat pewter Ohio wears in January, and the furnace clicked on and off with its own opinion about our conversation. Above us, the clock watched, its tick steady, its crack catching the faint light. I'd taken it down the week before, wiped away years of dust, and put it back up a little higher, so you had to look up to see it, a tiny private change that made me stand straighter every time I checked the time. "I still don't like the idea of you alone here," Karen said quietly, softer than all the lists she'd made. "I know," I answered, That's why we're adding rails in the bathroom and why I agreed to that medical alert bracelet, remember? And Mrs. Avery's number is stuck to the fridge now, and I promised to actually use the cane on bad days, not just pretend I don't need it because I'm vain. She smiled at that, a real one. You vain? She teased. You wore those awful gardening shorts for 20 years. They were comfortable, I retorted, then sighed. I'm not saying I'll never move, sweetheart. I'm saying I won't move because everyone panicked at once. When the time comes, and it will in some form, I want us making that decision from the same table, not opposite sides of a closed door. That made something in her face soften, her shoulders lowering, as if someone had quietly taken a bag of groceries out of her arms. Dan and I looked at our budget again, she confessed, almost shy. We're cutting back on some things. I don't want you to feel like a walking solution. I hate that you heard me sound like that. I hated it too, I admitted, because we'd promised Jacob we wouldn't keep feeding the polite silences that had made this so much worse. But I'd rather know the worst part of your thoughts and work from there than be patted on the head while you're drowning. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and this time I didn't hold back. My fingers curled around hers with all the history between us, scraped knees and late-night phone calls and grocery aisles. I'm still scared, she murmured. I know, I said. Me too. I get winded carrying laundry up the stairs now, and every time I step into the shower I think about statistics instead of shampoo. But being scared and being erased are two different things. The clock ticked, a tiny affirmation. Later, after she and Dan had left with a copy of Jacob's summary letter and a container of leftover stew, I stood in the quiet house and listened to the sounds I'd taken for granted all those years. The heater sighing, the refrigerator humming, the mail slot clattering as the day's envelopes slid in. One from the bank, confirming the changes we'd made. One from my grandson with a crumpled school photo he'd remembered to mail himself. I picked that one up first, of course, looking at his slightly crooked smile, and the way his hair stuck up at the back like his mother's when she was, his age. I thought about how, in one version of the last months, this picture would have been taped to a different fridge, in a condo I never chose, in a life someone else had organized. In this version, I taped it under the clock, just low enough for me to see when I passed, high enough that I had to lift my chin a little on purpose. The new normal didn't come with trumpets. It came with small, stubborn facts, a folder in the desk with my name on top and my letter inside. My own words explaining my choices for after I'm gone, kinder and clearer than any fight could be. A mutually agreed schedule of check-ins and grocery runs instead of surprise invasions and unspoken resentments. A standing Wednesday coffee with Helen where we gossip about everyone else's children and remind each other not to sign anything on a day we've cried. Me catching myself reaching for the top shelf and stopping, not because I'm afraid of being told off, but because I respect what my body has already carried me through. There are still mornings my knee aches so badly I shuffle from bed to kitchen like I'm made of hinges. Still nights when the crash replays in the dark and I lie awake counting my breaths instead of sheep. And I know there will be a day when this house really is too much, when the stairs feel like a mountain and the snow on the front steps like a dare I shouldn't take. But now, when that day comes, I will know that moving is something I chose in concert with my own voice, not a verdict handed down in my absence. I walked to the front door, touched the cool brass of the key on its hook, and felt, for the first time in a long while, that the promise it represented ran both ways. I had given this house decades of my life, and now it, in its own creaky, familiar way, was giving me time and space to finish that life on my own terms. "We're not done arguing yet, you know," I murmured to the empty room, thinking of Karen and Dan and the kids and whatever crises the next years would bring. "But at least we're arguing with the lights on." The clock ticked in reply, steady as a heartbeat, and I smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because, for once, the sound didn't make me feel like time was running out. It sounded like time was finally properly mine. And if this story felt a little too close to where you live, if you heard something of your own kitchen and your own quiet worries in these rooms, I want you to know you're not strange or ungrateful for feeling torn. It's a particular kind of ache to love people who are counting on your help, while also fearing they might pack you into their plans before you're ready. It can make you doubt your own worth until you start seeing yourself as a number instead of a person. You're allowed to notice the looks, the half-finished sentences, the way your name shows up in conversations about money and what-if storms. You're allowed to admit that it stings without deciding that anyone is pure villain or saint. We're all just tired souls trying not to go under. But that doesn't mean you have to float silently while others decide which way you drift. And if you ever find yourself staring at your own version of my clock, maybe it's the armchair you always sit in, or the chipped mug you drink from, or the key you hang by your door, take a moment and ask whose hands have been setting it all this time. You don't have to smash it or throw it away to reclaim your life. You might just need to take it down, wipe off the dust, and hang it back up a little higher, where you have to lift your chin to check the time. You don't have to shout or burn bridges to change the story. Sometimes the bravest thing is to make one phone call, to ask one clear question, to say, "I'd like to hear this from someone who doesn't stand to gain," or "I need to think before I sign," even if your voice shakes. Maybe your new normal is as small as moving a folder to the top of a drawer or insisting that hard talks happen when you are wide awake at the table, not when you're a shadow in the hallway. Whatever your version looks like, you're allowed to claim at least one corner of your life, one room, one decision, as truly yours, and to let the steady tick of that choice remind you, day after day, that you are still here and you still count.